Today we're here because we have a speaker, and that speaker is Elio Colavito. Goes by he or they. And Elio is a white trans interdisciplinary scholar and PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in the departments of history with a collaborative specialization in sexual diversity studies. He's a public historian, an oral historian, and a digital humanist whose passion is making a usable past accessible to trans plus communities. The title of Elio's talk is Another Like Me, Female to Male Information Activism and Community Formation in Canada and the US, 1970 to 2000. So please join me in welcoming Elio.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me all right. Someone sound off in the chat if you can't. Thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to be here. This is my second time at UVic, but my first time really diving into the trans-related stuff that's going on campus. So I'm very excited to be here. And yeah, this is my presentation, Another Like Me, Female to Male Information Activism and Community Formation in Canada and the US from around 1970 to 2000. You'll see those dates kind of expand and collapse as we go along. But this is kind of an abridged version of a part of my dissertation. So yeah, I'm super excited. Jason Cromwell was 20 years old and living in Spokane, Washington, when he found out that the male-to-female transsexuals in his local trans organization were going to take a 4.5-hour road trip to Seattle to get estrogen injections from a sympathetic doctor in 1972. Cromwell figured he would go along for the ride and see if he could get his first shot of testosterone. And when the group got to the clinic, the doctor started walking down the line and giving people their injections. He asked the injection that he received was estrogen, who answered in the affirmative. He knew from his research that testosterone was a cloudy substance, and this one was clear. Cromwell informed him that he was a female to male transsexual and that he hoped to get a shot of testosterone instead. The doctor gave him his second shot and sent him on his merry way. And it didn't even occur to this physician that anyone in the lineup could be anything other than male to female, which was indicative of the lack of visibility of trans men in trans medicine. Social reality mirrored the clinical world, and female to male transsexuals were often in an information desert. By this point in 1972, 20 years after Christine Jorgensen brought sex change to North America, and 8 years after Dr. Harry Benjamin coined the term transsexual, trans medicine was institutionalized in university-based gender clinics across Canada and the US. It was primarily believed to be a male-to-female phenomenon. From the publication of Benjamin's The Transsexual Phenomenon in 1966 to Dr. Ira B. Pauly's Female Transsexualism in 1974, sexologists estimated that the ratio of male to female and female to male transsexuals was somewhere between 8:1 and 2.5:1. And sexologists disagreed throughout that period on what that number actually looked like. Trans men's applications to university gender clinics increased steadily throughout the late 60s and 70s as second-wave feminists achieved progress towards legal gender parity in labor and divorce, which created the conditions under which pre-medicalized transsexual men could gain the independence required to pursue transition. And it wouldn't be until the early to mid-1980s that experts believed the ratio of incidence between F to M and M to F transsexualism was equal. In this talk, I will trace the emergence and development of female-to-male info activism and community formation from 1970 to the turn of the millennium. I use Kate McKinney's work on lesbian info activism, which describes a range of materials and processes constituting the collective, often unspectacular labor that sustains social movements, born of the frustrated desire to have information. That's my guiding framework. This, combined with Nan Boyd and Mark Stein's work on pre-political social formations in bars and neighborhoods, has also provided me with the scaffolding to think of information activism as the thing that sustained pre-political transmasculine social life, as it predated and facilitated the ontological, social, and political developments that structured transmasculine communities. Female-to-male information activism gave way to F to M specific subcultures and ways of understanding trans politics, community, and masculinity while forging local and national transmasculine kinship networks and affinities. However, this information activism often cemented racialized middle-class virility, respectability, and visibility as the linchpin of transmasculine information activism and community formation. But before we can really talk about my guys, we have to talk about Christine Jorgensen. When Christine Jorgensen arrived in the US from Copenhagen after her sex change in 1952, she was the first US citizen to bring transness to the public consciousness in that same way. And although sex change was a very ambiguous term that left much to the imagination, Jorgensen's story introduced one of the possibilities afforded by modern science to the masses, that one could change their sex. Her publicity marked sex change as a male-to-female phenomenon, a departure from the 1930s when international stories of female-to-male sex changes circulated the popular press. In the first few months of Jorgensen's return to the US, she received so many letters that even postage simply marked Christine Jorgensen USA found its way to her correct address. She received correspondence from across the world, and most of the letters that she received came from trans feminine writers who congratulated her on her sex change and who also expressed resonance with her story. Female-to-male transsexuals also wrote to Jorgensen, although in smaller quantities, to communicate the same resonance, except in reverse. For many who would go on to transition, it didn't even occur to them that females could become males too. Those who hoped for the possibility of becoming male knew it was a distant dream, made unobtainable by thousands of dollars and an ocean between. Access to hormone replacement therapy and surgeries was predominantly limited to wealthy, white patients who were adamant about receiving care and willing to go overseas for it. Jorgensen's media extravaganza also captivated the interest of Harry Benjamin, a German-American sexologist and endocrinologist who was working in the growing field of trans medicine. By the time that Jorgensen landed on US soil, he was one of the only physicians taking trans patients in both the US and Canada. And so, naturally, he became Jorgensen's doctor. Her publicity further solidified Benjamin as the primary point of contact for those who first sought trans medical care in the 50s and 60s, and the uptick in patient interest that followed Jorgensen's publicity encouraged Benjamin to specialize in trans medicine altogether. Benjamin's research culminated in the transsexual phenomenon, the first book-length text about and coining of the term transsexualism. The opening page of the book claimed that transsexuals were a small group of people, men more often than women, who wanted to change their sex. Written about his clinical practice with 172 transsexual patients, Benjamin's seminal work legitimized hormonal and surgical interventions for transsexualism. Out of his 172 patients, from the inception of his practice to the end of the study in 1964, only 20 of them were female to male. By the end of 1966, he took on an additional 135 patients, 128 of which were male to female transsexuals or transvestites, and there were about 7 female to males. Benjamin argued that transsexuals, or those who were not satisfied with cross-dressing alone and desired sex reassignment, should pursue surgical and hormonal treatments to remedy their conditions. Female-to-male transsexuals could skip directly to the brief 16-page chapter on female-to-male transsexualism. The symptomatology was defined by the strong conviction to be a man, disgust in his female anatomy, sexual and romantic attraction to feminine women, and identification with male roles. Benjamin estimated that the ratio of male to female and female to male transsexualism was anywhere between 8-to-1 or 3-to-1 based on his research. The transsexual phenomenon, however, was a traditional medical text and not exactly a bestseller. It was not until Jorgensen released her autobiography in 1967 that broader publics became aware of the transsexual. Throughout the 60s, several major universities discussed the formation of research units interested in transsexualism, but refrained from doing so out of fear of legal consequence and public controversy. The Johns Hopkins University Gender Identity Clinic's 1967 opening marked a transition from quiet deliberation to public recruitment for research on gender-affirming surgery, and similar clinics opened at other institutions, marked by interdisciplinary collaboration between psychiatrists, urologists, plastic surgeons, gynecologists, and social workers. University clinics were regulated by strict adherence to the diagnostic criteria of the true transsexual, or one who fit every aspect of the medical establishment's limited understanding of transsexualism as a binary and heteronormative transition. In addition to this, physicians were less likely to treat patients that they did not believe would pass in their newly assigned sex role. And as a result, affirmative trans medical care was mostly accessible to middle-class white transsexual women whose access was dependent on both economic independence and their clinical familiarity. By the mid-70s, transsexuals had access to info through gender identity clinics, advocacy groups, community periodicals, and some small social support groups in major urban areas in close proximity to these university gender clinics. Like the clinical settings that they often sprang from, these support services reinforced and bolstered the medical establishment's narrow understanding of transness. Erickson Education Foundation, founded and financially supported by millionaire philanthropist and female-to-male transsexual Reed Erickson, was the largest gender service organization of this era. The EEF provided its own services, acting as a referral agency, publicizing news about trans issues, and giving support to hundreds of isolated trans people around the world. The EEF worked with local and national news agencies to make information about transsexualism available to the public and supported college lectures about the topic. As a clearinghouse for trans and transsexual information, the EEF was an essential community resource. And although their resources were practical in offering detailed information about topics like hormone therapy, surgeries, and name change procedures, females to males still found themselves scouring pages of EEF resources to find just a few sentences related to them. Trans men had very precarious relationships with gender service organizations and clinics, as resources often neglected or contained little detail about female to males. And by 1975, 2 other trans men had emerged as community-based information activists and transition facilitators, one of them being Angelo Tornabene. Tornabene, you may know him better by his pen name Mario Martino. He's the author of Emergence, the first U.S. autobiography of a female-to-male transsexual. He was born in Gary, Indiana, to an Italian-American family in 1937. He had heard of Jorgensen's sex change when he was a child in 1952, but when she released her autobiography in 1967, he rushed to the bookstore to purchase a copy. Jorgensen fit Harry Benjamin's definition of a transsexual to a T, and Tornabene bet that he did too. He was finally equipped with the language that he needed, and so he contacted Harry Benjamin's practice in New York City. Following a short chain of referrals, he began hormone replacement therapy in 1967, and after attending a loosely organized trans support group primarily made up of trans women, he started the Labyrinth Foundation for Counseling and Gender Services in 1969. Labyrinth began as a post-operative halfway house where Tornabene and his wife, Dorcas, both nurses, used a room in their home for post-operative female-to-male surgical recovery, just 3 blocks away from the surgical clinic of Dr. Wesser in Yonkers, New York. LFCGS, or Labyrinth, quickly expanded, and the Tornabenes acted as a broker between transsexual patients and doctors. He wrote to health and licensing departments on behalf of patients, using letters of recommendation from performing surgeons and court mandates to authorize legal name changes. And he also wrote to universities to change names and sex on official transcripts. As an information activist and counselor, Tornabene also attended many professional conferences and formed relationships with doctors to better serve his community and to encourage the refinement of phalloplasty techniques specifically. Jude Patton, on the other hand, was 12 when Christine Jorgensen's story became national news, and he wondered if they did the same thing for females who wanted to be male. Even if they did, surely it would cost thousands of dollars in Europe, and so he kind of forgot about it. Patton had stellar high school grades, but he declined several university scholarships because he didn't want to wear skirts anymore, essentially. To go to university in this era, as a woman, one would have to wear a skirt or a dress, and so instead he decided to be what he called a truck driver dyke, a working woman who could adopt a man's haircut and dress in a blue-collar job. Patton could not maintain work due to his presentation, and so he eventually moved to Mar Vista, California in December of 1969, where he took a job as a pet groomer. While he was doing this job as a pet groomer, one of his coworkers, David, told him that he should probably come over to pick up a book that he thought would be good for Patton. And so Patton obliged and showed up to David's house. David, who then outed himself as a female-to-male transsexual, gave Patton a copy of Harry Benjamin's The Transsexual Phenomenon. And after a quick read, Patton was also sure that he fit the diagnostic criteria for transsexualism. He reached out to Field's endocrinologist, his friend David, who referred him to a different psychiatrist, and the two of them together labeled Patton a classic case, and he began hormone replacement therapy in 1969. When he went to Stanford University's Gender Identity Clinic for chest surgery in 1972, he was given the impression that he was only the third female to male to go through the program. In the early years of his transition, Patton scoured the UCLA and USC libraries for information about transsexualism and made copies for him to distribute to those in search of more information. In 1973, he asked his surgeon, Dr. Donald Laub, if he could attend a trans medical conference as his guest. Laub obliged, and Patton's conference attendance inspired him to take the podium as a trans educator in university classes. In 1976, Jude Patton co-founded Renaissance Gender Identity Services with a trans woman, Joanna Clark, a community-based human services organization that coordinated an educational and referral service in Southern California. Patton was the director of the Educational Services Division, where he provided training for community-based service organizations, professionals, paraprofessionals, as well as other trans people. He did public seminars, college and university lectures, and he alone tallied more than 100 speaking engagements in 1976 alone. By the end of the 70s, he was lecturing 7 days a week for college classes, seminars, and other interested groups. The sexual revolution of the 70s ushered in a wave of university courses on human sexuality in California, and Patton spoke for every single one of the instructors and everything from San Diego to the Mexican border up to Northern California, running around the classes to speak because nobody else was doing it. Both Tornabene and Patton came out in the mainstream press in 1976 and 77, respectively. Just shortly after female-to-male transsexual and former physical education teacher Steve Dane was outed. He was fired from his teaching job and outed in the national news. Where Dane was outed, Tornabene and Patton chose to come forward with the hopes that they might inform publics about female-to-male transsexualism and serve as role models to those they inspired. Both Tornabene and Patton communicated touchstone aspects of sexologists' understanding of female-to-male transsexualism: the desire to adopt men's social roles, the desire to have a phallus, discomfort in being identified as female, and the desire to be the male in a heterosexual relationship. One of the more salient examples comes from Tornabene's book, where he offers a brief reflection on the custom of Italian cheek kissing. Tornabene wrote that kissing was as much a part of our lives as was breathing. One kiss on each cheek, to be exact. Italians greet everyone regardless of who they are with cheek kissing. Once men reach a certain age, usually around puberty, they no longer have to do the cheek kissing. They just get to shake hands with one another. But they do continue to kiss the cheeks of women and children when they arrive and depart. Anyone who keeps getting kisses after a certain age is definitively a girl, past the point of no return. And in melding his cultural context with the clear diagnostic criteria of transsexual medical care, Tornabene does more than just vie for his cultural assimilation into normative understandings of manhood. He also provided other transsexuals a frame through which to communicate their life histories and cultural contexts that colored their masculinity. Jude Patton and Angelo Tornabene were established information brokers in their respective communities when they came out publicly, and their public transsexual profiles were information activist oriented. Both were deliberate in their framing of transmasculinity and transsexualism as they carved out the space for a respectable and normative trans manhood in the public imagination. Patton and Tornabene's use of the media was one of many strategies they both employed as info activists, and their media representation was tethered to publicizing their respective gender service organizations, Renaissance and Labyrinth. Gender service organizations served communities across Canada and the US, primarily in urban areas, with geographic proximity to affirmative trans medicine. And in the gender clinic era, these services brokered the relationships between patient and clinics and often provided additional support, such as change of legal name and sex marker assistance. Patton, who had a degree in social ecology and worked as a marriage counselor, leveraged his education to find his niche in counseling for those seeking sex reassignment. His proximity to Stanford University, the gender clinic in Palo Alto, and his professional relationship with Dr. Donald Laub was critical to his early success in Renaissance. Tornabene, on the other hand, was a registered nurse and PhD candidate who also used his education in service of other trans men. Like Patton in California, Tornabene's geographic and professional proximity to Dr. Wesser in Yonkers, New York, made his services pertinent in an already established trans healthcare hotspot. Renaissance and Labyrinth grew through the decentralization of trans medical care in the late 70s and early 80s, as Renaissance and Labyrinth partnered with endocrinologists and surgeons to provide full-service gender programs. The organizations went beyond referral services and organized the interconnected aspects of transition for their clients. According to Susan Stryker, 2 landmark events fundamentally changed the landscape of access to trans medicine in the US. The introduction of the Habigda Standards of Care in 1979, and the inclusion of gender identity disorder as an official psychopathology in the DSM in 1980. The Standards of Care codified the treatment protocols developed in university gender clinics, and the recognition of GID as a bona fide psychopathology created a situation in which they could better assert their professional competence based on their area of specialization, and thus gain greater status in the eyes of their peers. In this new order, Habigda-affiliated psychotherapists and other licensed professionals bore the brunt of the responsibility in screening transsexual patients, which protected doctors from medical malpractice suits. Both Patton and Tornabene were central in evaluating and referring patients to endocrinologists and surgeons. Steve Dane, the formerly fired physical education teacher, also out of a job and inundated with letters from desperate trans men, started to do the same thing in the early 1980s through the National Sex Forum. Rupert Raj served as the Canadian counterpart to the growing field of peer counseling in the late 70s and early 80s, and Steve Parent took up the charge in New England. As access to medical care, As access to medical care became more diffuse, female-to-male information activists brought in their goals to meet the needs of their growing community. Through the 60s, female-to-males rarely underwent phalloplasty, the surgical procedure aimed at constructing a penis, as it was still in its developmental stages. These procedures were very complex, they required several surgeries, and they had high risk of complications. And the results often left something to be desired, with issues like urinary function problems, erectile difficulties, and serious aesthetic concerns. Surgeons first attempted phalloplasty on amputees after World War I, and by the mid-century, the favored technique was a tube within a tube method that allowed for those with phalloplasty to urinate through the penis. In the late 40s, the plastic surgeon Sir Harold Gillies described the technique, developed in part by others, and constructed the first penis for an F-M in 1946. The first F-M phalloplasty performed in the US took place in the 60s by Dr. Ralph Miller Jr. in Miami, Florida. Johns Hopkins surgeons were the first to institutionalize phalloplasty in a university-based sex change clinic, and by the mid-70s, Drs. Ira Dershoff in Jacksonville, Florida, Donald Lobb at Stanford, and Dr. Stanley Biber in Trinidad, Colorado routinely performed phalloplasties. By the 1980s, the procedure was still very much being refined, and trans men had few viable options to manage genital dysphoria. Visual representations of phalloplasty that did exist were static, clinical, and could not accurately communicate the reality of what a phalloplasty could actually look like and do, in both the material sense and the personal. Anxiety about penile functionality and aesthetic dominated conversations about phalloplasty in F-M communities, as surgeons encouraged F-Ms who desired phallo to wait for medical advancements if they could. Those hoping for a cis-like penis were not in luck. Transmasculine information activism and peer support partially emerged to make info about phalloplasty more accessible outside of a clinical setting. Tornabene and Rupert Raj worked on penile prosthetic devices that supported erection and urination in the 70s and 80s, but to no avail. Female-to-male information activists connected with medical professionals and one another to stay informed, using their communication networks to keep up-to-date resources on phalloplasty. As trans men proliferated and joined trans support groups and organizations across Canada and the US, they grew very bored. For example, on December 10th, 1979, Diane, the returning image consultant for the Golden Gate Girls and Guys support group, shared tips on how to be the most elegant for the holiday season at the Metro Community Church in San Francisco. The 4Gs, as I'll call them here on out, was the Bay Area's earliest social and educational organization for trans people that also included support for those who identified as female to male, or F to M. But according to both Emmett Bodfish and his friend Lou Sullivan, the meetings were pretty boring. They were often the only 2 trans men in a room of 15 trans women, and they both lamented the fact that most of the group conversations were, as they put it, going in the opposite direction than they were. While trans men and women could relate to one another on so many levels, the nuts and bolts of social and medical transition were, and still are, very different. Trans men didn't need to know how to apply just the right amount of rouge, where to buy high heels in a size 13, or which surgeon crafted the most supple pair of breasts. Bodfish and Sullivan were 2 of many trans men in support groups across the US with an itch to scratch. They needed information that was pertinent to their own transitions as female to male. Amid growing tensions between female to males and the trans women they organized alongside, Lou Sullivan decided to resign as the editor of Golden Gate Girls and Guys newsletter, The Gateway, to focus on his efforts of supporting females to males. In 1980, he released the first edition of Information for the Female to Male Crossdresser and Transsexual, the first compendium of transmasculine resources in the US. Frustrated by the lack of transmasculine material available in trans texts, Lou Sullivan took them all and put them into one information packet with an embedded how-to guide. Sullivan first published the first edition of IFMCT shortly after the start of his own medical transition in 1980, and the second edition followed in 1985. In just 5 years, IFMCT expanded from 18 to 48 pages. It was distributed through the Janus Information Society, a trans group that Sullivan worked for in California, for $5 a copy. Sullivan mostly advertised the handbook in trans periodicals and made it accessible through gender clinics and private physicians. He was very strategic in his approach, sure to include advertisements in lesbian periodicals and hard copies in lesbian spaces that would accept them. Many trans men who came of age in the 80s and early 90s encountered this text and found value in it. For many, it provided them with the language they needed. The original text, though, was not prescriptive of sex reassignment surgery as inevitable, but offered readers many possible ways to actualize their masculinity. Sullivan wanted readers to know all of their options and opened the sex reassignment section with a very cautious reminder. He said, "Deciding to change your life and your body to that of a man will be the most important decision you'll ever make. Don't take the matter lightly." He argued that the choice to pursue medical transition was more difficult for female to males than male to females, as the female to male is looking toward the prospect of building a life as a man with little hope of ever being a physically complete male. That's a quote from Sullivan. This issue was frequently cited as a very key differentiation between F to Ms and M to Fs. M to Fs could have a normal vagina and become normal women, while F to Ms were still in pursuit of satisfactory genitoplasty. This fundamental fact, which was so central to conceptions of sex reassignment, necessitated a different set of conversations among F to Ms than M to Fs. And despite this, Sullivan assured IFMCT readers that there are numerous genetic males with deformed genitals, or who have lost their sex organs through accident or war, who continue to function as men without question of their gender. The text was capacious in that it validated multiple forms of embodiment predicated by historical examples of 17th and 18th century female-to-male passing and cross-dressing figures as historical evidence for female-to-male transsexual feelings. He mobilized history as an intellectual territory that serves political purposes and offered that perhaps anatomical females who passed as men in public might just as easily be recuperated as trans men. In IFMCT, Sullivan argued that probably the most important and reassuring thing for a female crossdresser to know is that, yes, there are others like her. He felt that these 17th and 18th century figures were a revelation. Yes, it is true that women have passed as men from time immemorial, that female-to-male crossdressers and transsexuals are not modern-day freaks who have invented a new perversion. The figures that he included in IFMCT were mostly white and upper class. Passing women in military garb and tuxedos graced the pages of IFMCT, establishing historical precedents for trans respectability. These images not only established legitimacy for transmasculine feelings, but also positioned historical trans men as honorable citizens with outstanding careers, a grasp at hegemonic cis masculinity defined by the ideal citizen worker. These examples provided white readers with possibilities in the face of what seemed impossible, that one could indulge in their trans feelings and live a noble, undoubtedly masculine life. Rupert, Raj, and Sullivan, who were long-term correspondents, continued to discuss the need for female-to-male specific resources. Rupert Raj, the editor of the Foundation for the Advancements of Canadian Transsexuals newsletter, Gender Review, left the organization to begin a female-to-male focused organization in 1980. He started the Metamorphosis Medical Research Foundation in 1982, an F2M exclusive gender counseling and education service. Raj primarily set his sights on improving phalloplasty, writing to research and surgeons about phalloplasty developments and penile prosthetic devices to better support his community. Metamorphosis also had a newsletter by the same name, and it was a crucial resource for trans men in both Canada and the US. Here, Raj published original articles, clinical research, and valuable information on hormones, surgery, passing, legal reform. He also intended to publish book reviews, referrals, poetry, cartoons, jokes, letters to the editor, success stories, personal profile, and mini autobiographies of other trans men. He also encouraged readers to contribute their own material to the newsletter to legitimize female-to-males as, quote, highly intelligent, well-educated, emotionally stable, financially successful, socially accepted, self-fulfilled, happy, parentheses, often family, men who contribute to society and are respectable, upstanding members of the community. Raj's plea to his soul brothers to improve the largely negative image of transsexuals and to do your part to set the story straight sought to construct the ideal transsexual male citizen in contrast to popular cultural depictions of trans women as self-hating, degenerate, lowly sex workers. Raj imagined Metamorphosis as an educational tool beyond the transsexual himself, and his writing was reflective of this desire to destigmatize transsexualism. I've left one of his poems, Gender Code, up at the front, but I'll also read it out loud. F to M's, we are men, not boys. We should be gallant gentlemen, not obnoxious bores. We will act like supermen, not as diesel dykes. M to F's, we are women, not girls. We should be lovely ladies, not sleazy sluts. We will act as Wonder Women, not as drag queens. Transsexuals, we are humans, not animals. We should be brothers and sisters, not sexist rivals. We will act as good neighbors, not as feuding enemies. Raj resisted dehumanization through the construction of a respectable trans subjecthood that argued that transsexuals could be and were unobtrusive and even heroic community members, not garish and problematic lower-class street queers. Trans men specifically should be charming and refined, classic markers of white upper-class respectability. This approach had valuable political utility as it reflected the biases that medical professionals use to legitimize denial of care. But by 1983, the need for female-to-male in-person social support groups emerged. Jude Patton, who hosted an annual trans meetup in Southern California since 1976, closed the event off to female-to-males only in 1982. The first female-to-male only support group, Under Construction, was founded by Jeff Shevlowitz in Southern California in 1983. In '86, Lou Sullivan started FTM, and Jason Cromwell ran the FTM support group out of Ingersoll in Seattle. Johnny Armstrong started FTM Fraternity in mid-1980s New York City, and Steve Parent started FTM specific support groups at the New England Gender Identity Clinic. These FTM support groups hosted roundtable conversations about surgeries with professionals and trans men where they could discuss their vulnerabilities in the safety of community space. Several trans men who spoke to groups about their results even did a little show and tell. Beyond the valuable and practical medical information, these conversations fostered intimacy through connected struggle between trans men who began to think of one another as brothers. By the mid-90s, most urban centers had at least one F2M support group, if not multiple. These groups also addressed the penis problem, if you will, in discussions about packing. Packing is the practice of wearing a prosthetic device in the underwear to create the appearance of a penis, used by trans men to better align their bodies with their feelings and to pass more effectively as male in public. In the late 70s to mid-80s, trans men coached one another on how to best fold a pair of tube socks and position it in your underwear to create the appearance of a handsome bulge. Not too big, but not too small. Imagine 12 trans men in a church basement stuffing socks into their pants and assessing one another's packages. By the late 80s and early 90s, taken with the DIY culture of the era, they made packers together in support groups. Narrators from my oral history interviews from San Francisco to Seattle to New York to Boston were told that the best way to pack was to take a condom, fill it with hair gel, take a second condom, fill it with hair gel, and to tie them together to look like a penis. The gel in a condom method provided more of a real feel, so if somebody wanted to get handsy with them, they could still choose whether or not to disclose if they were trans. At some point in the mid-90s, somebody figured out that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle slime was even better than hair gel because it didn't break down as quickly. These tips, tricks, and DIY parties perfectly encapsulate the organizing ethos of these groups, an ethos that prioritized brotherhood and fraternity in the pursuit of manhood. This brotherhood and fraternity, however, was not for everybody. This model privileged trans men who had genital dysphoria, felt the desire to pack, and implied that phalloplasty was the end goal of transition, pending advancements in surgical efficacy. Marcus, a former F2M member, recalled a support meeting where after about an hour he leaned over and whispered to his friend, "But what if I like my vagina?" His friend Steven sighed in relief. He liked his vagina too. Years of support group conversation transformed the conversations about penises altogether. Where medical professionals insisted that all trans men yearned for one, trans men forged a path to manhood that decentered full sex reassignment. In the mid-90s in Seattle, the F2M support group at Ingersoll actually splintered off into two groups. One that was a little bit more old guard in their views on sex reassignment, and one renamed Spectrum that hosted queer group meetings in a bar. The name Spectrum reflects its view that transmasculinity itself was a spectrum and that there was room for multiple forms of embodiment. In New York City, feminist pornographer Annie Sprinkle lent her apartment to Johnny Armstrong's F2M social and support group, F2M Fraternity, for 4 years. The people that gathered there affectionately called her apartment the Sprinkle Salon, and it operated as a kind of laboratory for people to explore gender and sexuality in all kinds of ways. It was where that Sprinkle met Les Nichols, a flirtatious fraternity member who made the commute from Boston to New York to attend F2M meetings. Nichols was already several years into his transition from female to male after years on testosterone, chest surgery, and body masculinization surgery. Shortly after meeting Sprinkle, Nichols left the East Coast for Trinidad, Colorado, where he underwent phalloplasty by Dr. Stanley Biber in July of 1989. Nichols opted to undergo the abdominal tube method, the simpler of two phalloplasty methods, which allowed for an erection but not urination. He left his vulva unchanged so that he could urinate and reach orgasm. Sprinkle and Nichols began dating, and after a while decided that it was time to produce the first F2M porn film ever made. The 30-minute educational docudrama, co-produced by Annie Sprinkle, Les Nichols, and Johnny Armstrong, was the first F2M porn film ever made. Dense with information, the film's sex scenes are playful and tender. The genuine enjoyment between both parties is palpable. Confessional-style interviews with Nichols break the film up into the most perfectly terrible 30 minutes of film ever. Sprinkle educates the audience about the process leading up to Nichols' phalloplasty while she touches and performs oral sex on his genitals. After describing his penis, Sprinkle explains genitoplasty as well as the two available methods for phalloplasty with diagrams and all. Sprinkle's voiceover narration presented the audience with a medically accurate and easy to understand information with detailed descriptions of the real-life look and feel of a phalloplasty. Born out of a support group with resource sharing at the core of the project, Annie Sprinkle took out a 2-page spread in the February 1990 issue of Hustler magazine to promote the film. Johnny Armstrong, F2M organizer and co-producer of Linda, Les, and Annie, sent a copy of the film to F2M in San Francisco. F2M screened the film in a 1990 support meeting and published an article about the Hustler article in their newsletter, sparking the first complex intra-community controversy. 20 F to M's and 2 friends attended the 15th F to M get-together in San Francisco. And in advance of the gathering, F to M newsletter forewarned attendees that the group would screen the movie and that it contains explicit sexual images and depictions of surgery. Jameson Green, the future head of F to M, moderated the meeting. He cautioned the group's first-timers about the film and encouraged them to remember that what they were about to see was likely not representative of the transsexual community as a whole. The group laughed and groaned through the film, and one F to M and his 2 friends left before the midpoint. Most people applauded the effort, and some even shared their concerns that Nichols would become representative of all F to M's in the public eye. Several of my narrators recall watching this film, noting the importance of the visual representation, but privileging the idea that Nichols did not accurately portray trans men. Members of F to M in San Francisco, James Green and Lauren Cameron, responded to the film with photos of their own genitals published in a 1991 issue of On Our Backs, a lesbian kink periodical. They felt that these images were accurate, unbiased, and most importantly, placed in the correct avenue. Still, the experience with the photographer was so uncomfortable that it inspired Lauren Cameron to learn photography himself. Cameron published some of the photos that he took in his 1996 Body Alchemy, a series of photographs that celebrated female-to-male transsexualism. The photos included nude photos of Cameron and other female-to-males, with some close-up shots of both phallo and metoidoplasty in the collection. More importantly, though, Body Alchemy featured trans men in their everyday lives, as religious leaders, construction workers, horseback riders, and in other undoubtedly masculine roles. Finally, the culmination of 25 years of female-to-male information activism, which sought to elevate trans men as normal, respectable men, was available on bookshelves across Canada and the US. The late 90s brought with it the accessibility of the internet, and slowly in-person support groups waned. Online bulletins and listservs for F2M passing tips and camping trips began to populate the web. While this made the information more accessible to some, it also opened the space for nasty critique of one another. In 1999, when Matt Rice became pregnant with his first child, the listservs and the bulletin boards were on fire, with trans men debating back and forth about whether or not a trans guy should want to be pregnant in the first place. More than ever before, trans men were steadfast in their beliefs on how to properly transition. Factions formed, and a new era of transmasculine organizing began. Thank you.